Welcome, everybody. I'm Adina Canefield, the CEO of NLI USA, and I am absolutely delighted to bring you this talk as part of the NLI USA Signature Speaker Series. We established this series really to recognize and amplify the commitment of the National Library of Israel to be a gathering place, to be a hub of conversation, to be a place of ideas, and to bring those ideas to address contemporary issues of our day. So many of us are turning to the words of Leonard Cohen, whether at synagogue or at home, or just as a preliminary before a program, as we just did, and his words always resonate with us, and especially now as our world is literally burning around us. This talk today, I am proud to bring you Matti Friedman and Nicole Krauss, who will be in conversation around Matti's new book, Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen in the Sinai. This is our second event with the Sammy Rohr Prize Writers Showcase, and we are absolutely thrilled to be partnering together to highlight great Jewish authors and to advance the literary field of Jewish pieces and of literature in general. This is a participatory session. At the end of the talk, you will be asked to pose questions. Actually, you can pose them throughout the talk, and those questions will be addressed at the end by Nicole and Matti. And now I'm privileged to invite my colleague, Deborah Goldberg, who is the director of the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, who is going to have the honor of introducing Matti and Nicole to you today. Deborah?
Thank you, Adina. On behalf of the Sammy Rohr Prize, I want to express our appreciation for our new association with the National Library of Israel, and of course, for the opportunity to share this wonderful program for you and with you. This is an exciting time for us. Together, we have just recently announced this year's winner of the Sammy Rohr Prize, Menachem Kaiser, for his book Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure. We hope that we will be able to bring Menachem to you sometime soon in upcoming events with NLI USA. Now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce and welcome our speakers for today. Matti Friedman is an award-winning journalist and author. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, and many other publications. Matti has won numerous awards for his books, including the Natan Prize and the Canadian Jewish Book Award for Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. His first book, The Aleppo Codex, received the American Literature Association's Sophie Brody Medal and was the 2014 winner of the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. Nicole Krauss has been hailed by the New York Times and others as one of America's most important novelists. She is the author of the award-winning novels Forest Dark, Great House, The History of Love, and Man Walks into a Room. Her most recent book, To Be a Man, is her first collection of short stories and won the Wingate Literary Prize earlier this year. Nicole's fiction has been featured in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Harper's Magazine, among others. And in 2021, she received the Sammy Rohr Inspiration Award for Fiction in recognition of her career achievements. With that, I give you Matti and Nicole.
Okay. Well, Deborah, thank you. One of the things that you didn't say, and that I think we should warn the audience about, is that while we intend for this to be an absolutely professional discussion, Matti and I have been friends for more years than I can count. And our conversation about Israel, about our lives, about our books has been going on for a very long time. And Matti, I'm thinking about how I sat in this chair at this desk talking to you about this book when it was in manuscript and how exciting it was to read it then. And I want to also tell you that I reread it And I cried again at the end. You get me every time. This is such an incredibly beautiful book. For those of you who haven't read it yet, I'm envious that you're going to have the chance to do so. And I also just want to say a small note. Matti has a cameo appearance, at least one, in my books. And although I don't literally have a cameo appearance in this one, I take this book personally on so many levels. And Matti, not just because you wrote it, but because I was conceived at the very end of the Yom Kippur War, and my gestation matches, and we realized this, I think, when I was reading your manuscript, my gestation matches exactly that of Leonard Cohen's album, New Skin for the Old Ceremony, which came out exactly a week before I was born. And so when I listen to this album and I listen to these songs, I feel somehow that they are telling me something about where I come from very specifically. So I want to start with origins, in a sense, and the origins of this book. And I'm wondering kind of where it began for you, whether it began in synagogue in Israel, singing the Yom Kippur Prayers to the tune of a Leonard Cohen song, or whether it began with the discovery of a lost manuscript of Leonard Cohen's writings during this time, or someplace else entirely.
First of all, thank you so much for those kind words, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Nicole, you're not just a friend of mine, you're one of my favorite authors, and it was worth writing the book just to hear you say that. So I really, really appreciate it. I grew up with Leonard Cohen in the background, as one does if you're Canadian, and certainly if you're a Canadian Jew, and moved to Israel when I was 17. That was 1995. And I admit I didn't think much about Leonard Cohen for many, many years. I think he's a singer for adults. You know what I mean? So I didn't have a lot to say about him when I was 17 or 23 or 27. But then he showed up in Israel in 2009 as part of this incredible last act, maybe the greatest last act in musical history, or certainly one of the greatest, where Leonard Cohen, having been, of course, a major star of the 60s and 70s, spends a few years kind of out of touch with the world in a Zen Buddhist monastery in California, and emerges to discover that a former manager has stolen all of his money. And he's forced to go back on the road as an elderly guy. He's in his mid-70s. And when he goes back out on the road, he discovers that not only has he faded from the popular imagination, in fact, he's kind of ascended to the very heights of fame. And he finds himself not playing in, smoky bars or small auditoriums, which is how it starts. He fills arenas across the world and has this incredible reconnection with his global audience, which turns out to be vast in places like Dublin and Barcelona and Israel, and even in inconsequential countries like the United States of America and in Canada, of course, where we're both from. And he shows up in Israel for the last concert of this initial phase of this resurrection tour. And when he showed up in Tel Aviv, Israelis went nuts for Leonard Cohen. And it was the first time I'd ever noticed how much Israelis love Leonard Cohen. I really didn't know that. I mean, for Canadians, he's obviously a cultural hero, in part because Canada hasn't produced that many figures of towering international cultural significance. But I couldn't quite figure out what was going on with Israelis who were just, knocking down the doors to get tickets to this concert. 50,000 people eventually come out to this concert in a country that's basically the size of New York in terms of population. And the phone lines crashed when tickets went on sale, and tickets were being scalped for ridiculous sums of money. And I just couldn't figure out quite what it was. Part of it, of course, was the fact that he's a Jew and his texts are deeply Jewish, but that didn't explain it enough. And then I saw an article in one of the Israeli dailies, in Yediot Achronot, about this concert tour that had taken place in 1973, so decades earlier. And it turned out that this was a story that many Israelis knew. No one really knew the details. It wasn't entirely clear what had happened or what he was doing here, but he had been at the very tip of the Sinai front in the Yom Kippur War. And that really struck me as a story that had to be unpacked at some point. And it took me many years to do it. You could do the math between 2009 to the book's publication date about a month ago. But it did turn out to be a story worth telling.
So I think, part of this story is about timing and about the moment that this, in Leonard Cohen's life, that this war found him, if we can put it this way. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, about who he was. I know he was 39. He was living on the Greek island of Hydra with his wife and child. And to some degree, he had hit a kind of artistic wall and decided to, I think, as you put it somewhere, insert himself into this catastrophe in the Middle East. Can you paint that picture a little bit more clearly for us?
So Leonard Cohen is 39 years old, and he is in a very dark state of mind. And the way we know this is thanks to this manuscript, this really unique manuscript, which he writes immediately after the war and then never publishes. And I found a reference. I owe, a debt to certain people for discovering this manuscript. I found a reference to it in a biography of Leonard Cohen that was published in the 90s called Various Positions by Ira Nadel, and contacted Ira, and he helped me kind of find more or less where this manuscript was, which turned out to be a university library in Hamilton, Ontario. And then a very intrepid librarian at the McMaster University Library named Chris Long dove into the stacks and helped me, find this incredible 45-page typed manuscript, which is wild and raw and unfiltered. It's Cohen, it's unmistakably Cohen, but it's without the filters, it's without editing. It's a first draft of something that was very urgent for him, but eventually he decides that it's better off in a drawer, or someone else decides, and it's never published. And that manuscript really describes a moment in his life which is very, very dark, which I had never understood about the 73 tour, in which no one had, I think. He was 39, which is a prime age for a male crisis. He had a young child. His first child, Adam, was about a year old. He was living with a woman named Suzanne, not the Suzanne of the song Suzanne, who's a dancer in Montreal, but a woman with whom he had a very long relationship, and ultimately 2 children. And things, according to this manuscript, are not going very well, and he feels trapped. He's living on this Greek island called Hydra. And of course, an island is a place where you can escape to, but an island is also a place where you're stranded. And he felt stranded. At the same time, his career, in his own opinion, had kind of hit a wall. And he actually announced that same year that he was leaving the music business, that he had nothing left to say. He says to one interviewer, "I just want to shut up." And he kind of retreats to this island and he's in a funk. And that's quite clear when the war breaks out. So on October 6, 1973 at 2 p.m., sirens go off across Israel on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, taking the country completely by surprise. And it ends up being maybe the darkest moment in Israel's history post-1948. And Cohen hears the news of this war on the island. And surprising everyone, including himself, I think, he walks out of this little white fisherman's cottage where he lived on Hydra, and he walked down the stairs to the docks at Hydra, and he got on a ferry to Athens. And in Athens, he gets on a flight to Tel Aviv, and that's how he ends up being a part of this, incredible, very upsetting and incredibly powerful Israeli moment in October 1973.
And I remember that when we were discussing your manuscript, we kind of paused on this fact that he didn't bring a guitar. And I remember just finding that so fascinating, because what did he imagine he was going to do in Israel, if not play? And clearly playing, both because he had reached the end of what he thought was an artistic road. And, I guess he had other visions in mind. I wonder if you could give us a sense of what you think he meant to do when he arrived, and how that sort of got turned around and redirected.
So my assumption upon embarking on this research was that he'd intended to come to play for troops. It started out with me trying to find Israeli soldiers who had encountered Cohen in Sinai. And that took several years, and I would get a phone number of someone who'd seen him, and they would give me a phone number of someone else. And I started to understand that certain units had seen him, and I tried to figure out what had happened to each unit before and after the show. But the big question mark at the center of the story was, what was Cohen thinking? And I mean, as a kind of funny anecdote, I started working on this book when Cohen was still alive, because I started thinking about it in 2009. And at some point I figured out that my Canadian publisher, McClellan and Stewart, was Cohen's publisher. And I sent my editor an email saying, I have this idea for a book about Cohen's bizarre tour in the middle of the 1973 war. Can I interview Leonard Cohen? And he said, I don't see why not. I said, really? So in my mind, I was already sitting with Leonard Cohen in his living room, sipping whiskey and talking about this experience. In my imagination, the living room was in Montreal, of course, even though Cohen had lived in Los Angeles for years. So this is an entirely imaginary scenario in my head. And my editor said, just write a pitch for the book and attach just a few paragraphs about what you're thinking. I did that, and I stuck in this picture, this photograph, maybe the most famous photograph from this tour, which is a photograph where you see Cohen standing next to Ariel Sharon, General Ariel Sharon, these two great Jewish archetypes, complete opposites in many ways, but not in all ways. And I pasted that picture into the Word document, emailed it to my editor, and he said, yeah, great, we're going to pass it on to Leonard Cohen's people, and we're going to set it up. And I went to bed, euphoric about the possibilities. And I woke up the next morning with an email from my editor, from Doug Pepper, in my email inbox. And you'll pardon my language, but the subject line was "Holy shit." And it was just a link to the obituary. And that's how I missed interviewing Leonard Cohen. And then fate, I think, felt really bad about what it had just done to me. So it kind of realigned and then helped me to find this manuscript, which ended up being a goldmine, and in many ways, I think, more useful to me as a researcher than interviewing Leonard Cohen as an old man, because it was so fresh and it was so obviously, an attempt by Cohen to process this immediately in the aftermath of the war. So we can understand that he came in part to escape his own crisis. In many ways, Israel's crisis was a way out of his own personal crisis, which I think might have been more urgent for Leonard Cohen. And part of it, of course, was a deep identification with the Jewish people and this idea that you don't stand idly by your brother's blood, which is an idea from the Bible. And, if the Jewish people are in crisis, and he says this explicitly afterward, he's going to be there. And he just comes. He comes without a plan. He tells the people who he meets that he wants to volunteer on a kibbutz, which is something that American volunteers had done in 1967, 6 years earlier, to replace men who'd been called up to fight. So, he'd pick the oranges or harvest the wheat or whatever. And he comes without a guitar, and he comes having announced his retirement from music. So I don't think he came as Leonard Cohen, the rock star, and I don't think he even knew about the Israeli tradition of playing for soldiers. When there's a war in Israel, and certainly in those years, artists would just get in their cars and go off to the front. Of course, the front in Israel is very close, right? There's no flight to Vietnam. It's just a drive up the road, basically. And artists take their instruments and go to entertain troops. But I don't think he knew that. How could he have known that? So he bums around the country for a few days and meets some very interesting people. And it's in his manuscript, parts of which I quote in the book. And then he's sitting at a cafe in Tel Aviv. And that ends up being kind of the crucial meeting. He's sitting at a bohemian haunt in Tel Aviv called Cafe Pinati, which is where you go to meet, the Israeli celebrities of the time. There aren't very many. Israel is a country of barely 3 million people, and there are like 2 cool cafes, both of them in Tel Aviv. And he's in Cafe Pinati when he's recognized by a few Israeli musicians who were quite famous in Israel, but Leonard Cohen did not know who they were. And after arguing among themselves about whether or not that was actually Leonard Cohen sitting in the corner, they gather their courage, and one of them walks over and asks Leonard Cohen if he's Leonard Cohen. And when he says that he is, they convince him to come with them as they set off to play for troops. And they find him a guitar somewhere, and they get into a Ford Falcon, which belonged to a singer named Oshik Levy, who was a big star at the time. And that's how the story starts.
Right. So he sets off for these concerts, and we don't have really any documentation aside from a few photographs, which are incredible and are included in the book. We don't really have any documentation of what these concerts sounded like or were like. And yet in your book, along with this incredible manuscript that Cohen wrote, you build these really beautiful, really evocative scenes of these concerts through soldiers' testimonials. And I just want to read a tiny paragraph. You write, a singer whose themes were human imperfection and transience, and the brief pleasures that can sweeten your night, found himself in front of people for whom those weren't abstractions floated into the air of a dorm room. They knew death was waiting for them when the concert ended. He played for them knowing his music might be the last thing they heard. And of course, there were survivors. So for some of them, it wasn't the last, although for many it was. And I wonder if you could describe for us a little bit how you found these people, what those interviews were like, maybe what surprised you about people's memories of these concerts.
Sure. And I just want to remind you that that line he played for them, knowing that it could be the last thing they heard, was actually a suggestion from you. Because when I wrote that line, and this is, I think, indicative of where I'm coming to this story, I wrote, they heard him knowing it might be the last thing they heard. Because when I imagine myself in the scene, I'm not Leonard Cohen, I'm one of the soldiers. And when you read the manuscript, you said, no, it should be he played for them, knowing it might have been, which of course is correct. But that just kind of threw into relief where I see myself in the story, in my mind, being Israeli and having been in the army. And I imagine myself, listening to Cohen play, and it's harder for me to imagine myself in his shoes. So Israel is such a small country, which is really lucky if you're a journalist and people know each other. So the way I found soldiers was just through the Israeli, network. I would find someone and they would say, oh, you should really speak to Moshe. Call up Moshe and be like, no, I wasn't there, but Itzik was there. Call up Itzik, and Itzik would say, yeah, not only was I there, I took pictures of the concert and here they are. And that's the way it went. And I did research, and I should say this because it's extremely important. At the National Library, as I've done for every single book I've ever written, the National Library has played a key role in my research. It's just the most amazing research institution, certainly in the Jewish world. So I used the newspaper archives at the library to find soldiers who'd mentioned Leonard Cohen in interviews over the years, and singers who'd mentioned playing with Leonard Cohen or playing in the war. And I started putting it all together. And what I noticed when I spoke to these soldiers was, who are of course in their 70s at this point. So this is something that happened to them when they were 18 or 19, and now they were grandparents, and they'd never forgotten it. And it's quite bizarre, right? Because this isn't a battle. This isn't, the turning point of the war. This is just a strange footnote to the Yom Kippur War. And yet anyone who saw Leonard Cohen seems to have, filed it pretty close to the front of their memories of the war. And I met people who told me incredible stories, both about the concerts themselves, but also about where they'd been 10 minutes before the concert, the awful things that they'd seen, the morning before they met Leonard Cohen, what happened to them the night after they happened to hear Suzanne played next to some burned out tanks in the Sinai desert. It was so strange that Leonard Cohen showed up in the war that it really stood out. There were also Israeli artists playing for the troops. All of the greatest performers in Israel at that time were at the front playing. Kaveret being, a major pop act, Hagashash Chiver, all of the great, music and comedy acts were there, but those were Israelis. That was to be expected. They spoke Hebrew. They were part of the war. Leonard Cohen was an international star. He wasn't from Israel, and he didn't speak modern Hebrew. And the soldiers, most of them didn't know English. And yet here he was. And he was there by himself. He wasn't accompanied by an entourage. He wasn't being filmed, which is why we have no video of the tour. He seemed to be on some kind of personal mission that remained quite mysterious until, I've tried to explain it in the book with, some success, but maybe not complete success. But the whole experience was so strange, just to be in the middle of this absolute catastrophe. 2,600 Israelis die in the 3 weeks of the Yom Kippur War in a country that's barely 3 million people. It's a disaster from which, in many ways, the country does not recover. Israel's a different country after 1973 and is still haunted by 1973. And in the midst of this, you hear Suzanne, or you hear, the Sisters of Mercy. And something about the bizarre nature, the power of the lyrics, just the strange effect of a transmission from outer space. Something about that really lingered with the people lucky enough to hear Cohen in Sinai.
So I want to talk about those changes in the country maybe a little bit later in the interview. I hope we're going to have time, but I really want to talk about the changes in Cohen himself, because I think one of the things that fascinated me most about this book was the way in which it is about art, and it is also about many things, but it's about an artistic rebirth in a sense. So we started this interview by talking about how Leonard Cohen felt that he'd hit this wall and come to a kind of terminal end. And we know the rest of the story, right? About everything that happens afterwards. So we know that not to be the case at all. And I'm curious and fascinated by this idea of the way in which this extremely dark experience kind of mined or carved out of Leonard Cohen a new depth or dimension. So if you will just indulge me a little, I want to read a couple of sections from your book. There's an incredible speech that you quote from 1964, which when Cohen was still just a Canadian poet, forgive me, Nancy. He enraged his listeners because he sort of dismissed this Jewish community from which he came as a hollow perversion of their divine mission. And he says, "We cannot face heaven. We have lost our genius for the vertical. Jewish novelists or sociologists, horizontalists, and the residue of energy left from that great vertical seizure we had 4,000 years ago that we turn toward ourselves. We knock on our own doors and wonder that no one answers." And then you say what was needed now, he inveighed, wasn't priests, but prophets, dirty saints, monstrous hermits. He called, quote, for a moratorium on all religious services until someone reports a vision or breaks his mind on the infinite. It's a stunning speech. And then you talk about how this is one reason why when Yom Kippur arrived in 1973, the synagogue's most famous son wasn't there. He hadn't followed his father and uncles into the community leadership or the garment business. He was somewhere far away in the Mediterranean. And as the book progresses, there's a suggestion, right, that Cohen was both searching for this vertical seizure in Israel, which he calls, I mean, this is fascinating, we could have a whole conversation about this, he calls his mythical home. But he's also at the same time delivering to the soldiers these ballads, sung in the desert. He's delivering some kind of spiritual relief, I suppose. And I wonder if you think that these experiences in the Sinai and the war deepened his genius for the vertical, as he put it, and by which we mean his art, and how.
I love that speech. I'm so glad that you quoted it. And I wish I could take credit for writing it. He is addressing his community in Montreal. He grows up in this really important synagogue in Montreal called Shara Shomayim, and he's descended from presidents of the community, and the Cohens are a very important family in the community, and he ends up rejecting it in this very kind of public way, and he calls them horizontalists, and he has that great line where he says, "Once we had a vertical seizure," which is just a line that I absolutely love, and he's referring, I think, to the revelation at Sinai. That's the vertical seizure. He says it happened, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. We were assembled as a people and we looked up and God spoke to us. And it was kind of just an absolutely wild moment of, horns blowing and fire from the mountain and smoke. And there were voices, according to the Bible, that you could see the voices. So all kinds of crazy stuff was happening in this vertical seizure from which the Jewish religion emerges, at least in large part. And he says, today we're just knocking on our own doors. Today it's all like synagogue dues and the day school and what we're wearing to high holiday services and who has a bigger car. And he basically slams the door and walks out, and he ends up in the village, and then he ends up in Greece on this island, and he goes very, very far. But he has this idea of a vertical seizure, and it's just kind of an interesting detail in the story. Where does the vertical seizure happen? The one that he's referring to happens at Mount Sinai, and where does he go looking for his vertical seizure? In Sinai. The story of this book of Who by Fire plays out within about 50 miles of Mount Sinai. So that's not on purpose, right? And it's also the kind of detail that you can't really invent if you're a novelist. Luckily for me, in this case, I'm a journalist. So I just, that's what happened. I'm just writing it down, and it's quite an amazing thing. So I think he wanted something wild to happen, and he understood that, the heart of Judaism was this prophecy, was this kind of story about this group of slaves who are crossing the desert, trying to get out of, the house of bondage. And they were just trekking across the desert, and God was speaking to them, and he was appearing as a pillar of fire, and he was appearing as a pillar of smoke, and he was bringing water from rocks and feeding them and punishing them and plague. And he wanted that. He thought that was the heart of the Jewish experience that we'd forgotten. He wanted to access that. And I think that's in part what he was trying to do. And he in this very unique manuscript, if you read it carefully, one of the themes of it that repeats a few times is that he thinks that in Israel, which he calls his myth home, that he can be reborn. He says this is a place that where you can be born again. And in another place, he says this is a place where you can sing again, because he's lost his voice. He seems to have lost his faith in his art, not for the first time or the last time, by the way, but this is something that had happened right at that time. And he has this idea that something will happen to him here that will get him out of the rut that he's in. He's hoping for a vertical seizure. And that seems like a very unrealistic expectation, except it seems to have happened.
Right. So, I mean, I think it's fascinating that he chooses this place, to return, so to speak, to this mythical home for the possibility of this rebirth. But at the same time, like his relationship to Israel is complex. Well, maybe we'll talk a little bit later about how he remembers this time. We'll get to that at the end. But in the meantime, when he heads to this place, so we've heard a little bit about his, how he feels about his Montreal Jewish community, but at the same time, I don't remember exactly. Oh, this may have been a much later quote, but he says, this is in your book, a lot of people who think that I've changed my religion look very suspiciously or even scornfully or even express great disappointment that I've abandoned my own culture, that I've abandoned Judaism. Well, I was never looking for a new religion. I have a very good religion, which is called Judaism. I have no interest in acquiring another religion. And then you also describe how he once responded with scorn to another famous Montreal writer, Mordechai Rickler, who rejected the Jewish community in the country that produced him and suggested in 1964 that Canada dissolve itself into the United States. And Cohen thought the only culture worth anything came from the loyalty to a language you write, a group, a place, and that a world without these differences would be unbearable. Only nationalism produces art, he said. I pause. I mean, I was so surprised by that sentence. It's kind of an astonishing statement, I find. And yet it does seem to lie, however fitfully, below much of this book. I wonder if you can say more about it and how you understand it.
So that is an incredible line. And I have to credit Liel Leibovitz, who wrote a very interesting book about Leonard Cohen. And that picked up on that line, which surprised me as well, although I don't think it should have. We don't want to confuse Leonard Cohen with someone like John Lennon and the Imagine idea where there's a world without borders and without religions. And that was very much not Leonard Cohen. And you don't often hear Leonard Cohen kind of putting down other artists, but he has a few sharp comments about John Lennon. He once said, you'd never catch me, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, you'll never catch me writing a phrase like give peace a chance. I don't like those slogan writers. That's what he said. So he's not into that whole thing. And I think he thinks a world where there are no differences, which might be where we're heading. We'll see, where it's just flat. I think that sounded to him like a nightmare. That culture could only be produced by a certain group of people sharing, a language, sharing traditions, and living on a specific piece of land. And that very much, it's very Jewish, of course, but it's also very Montreal. Montreal's a very rooted community. It's very different from Toronto, which is where I grew up. In Montreal, you have, in Leonard Cohen's case, a Jewish minority living amid an English-speaking minority, living amid a French-speaking minority, living amid the English-speaking majority in Canada. So everyone is kind of very much in their group, and everyone knows who they are, and you define yourself, vis-a-vis your neighbor who is someone else. And Leonard Cohen comes out of that place where there's no one who's generic, right? You're either you're a Jew from Westmount, you're a Francophone from, wherever. So everyone you're a Protestant from, some other part of Montreal, but no one's just generic. Of course, only group identity could produce art. And I don't think Leonard Cohen meant that we need to, be chauvinistic or hate each other. Of course, that wasn't what he was saying, but I do think that he thought that specificity was good. And that's why he argued with Richler about, dismantling Canada, because he says Canada is like the Jews. We exist on the periphery of the empires, and we're constantly defining ourselves by looking at the empire. And he liked Canada. He thought Canada should definitely exist, and he thought Jews should definitely exist. And I don't think he would have considered, dismantling the culture that produced him. He grows up immersed in Jewish culture. He grows up in the synagogue, not just hearing the cantorial music of Shara Shamayim, not just, being immersed in the language of the Bible, but his grandfather is a pretty well-known scholar of Hebrew grammar from Kovno, Lithuania. And he grows up really kind of soaked in this stuff. And the idea that we're going to replace it with Imagine or with, Amazon and the internet to update the point a bit. I think he thought that sounded really like an apocalyptic scenario. And of course, I agree.
I think, it's interesting. Maybe it's just the largeness with which that statement sort of arrives, because I think you and I would both think of that in terms of like the luck of every writer or journalist or novelist is born into their neighborhood, so to speak. And I always think of my neighborhood, the luck of being born into a neighborhood of 3,000 years of history. And I think that's something that Cohen celebrated and reveled in, and we find it everywhere in his work. In that sense, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Sure, even if you rebelled against it, like, of course, part of who Cohen is a rebellion against that. And even the song "Who by Fire" is inspired by the liturgy, but he's also kind of not making fun, but he's having fun with the liturgy. But if you don't have that, then what are you going to rebel against? Like, right. You have to have something, even if you want to reject it.
Right. I guess, another thing that fascinated me about this whole interlude in his life is this question, that sort of underlays every artist's life, of doubt and the question of, whether one is fraudulent in some way. And, you described that incredible concert the year before. So Leonard Cohen goes in 1972 to Jerusalem, right? He gives this concert. I'm correct, right? This is the one in which he kind of can't perform, and he's taken some acid that couldn't have helped, but there seems to be something else happening in which it's almost like in the face of people of Jerusalem, he's silenced and can't go on until they sort of encourage him and begin to sing to him. And he finally sings back, but, full of tears. And later on, he writes about that concert, and he says, those feelings have always circulated around my psyche. Where do you get to stand up and speak? For what and whom? And how deep is your experience? How significant is anything you have to say? And you write, this is, I think, later another point in your book, you write, did Cohen really think a song could protect these young people? He mentions the same idea in his manuscript about the war. I said to myself, perhaps I can protect some people with this song, he wrote. Perhaps he thought that if your spirit is fortified in battle at the crucial moment by deep wisdom, a blessing, a love letter, a song, you'll know how to dive or swerve or pull the trigger when necessary. And I think, the moral question of playing for these soldiers and the question of what role art can have in a war, whether the spirit of a poet can be significant to a soldier who's about to fight and potentially die. Can you talk a little bit about how your book speaks to this question?
So there's this really interesting idea, which Cohen mentions in his manuscript, which is the one that you mentioned, which is that maybe his songs can help. And I think that it's a strange idea, and it might be in part a response to helplessness, which I think comes from a feeling of maybe inadequacy. He's an artist, he's a guy with a guitar, and he's facing these, dozens, in some cases, maybe a bit more, in many cases, maybe a bit less. We have accounts of him playing for 3 or 4 soldiers, but these are people who have everything on the line. I mean, it's a matter of life and death for them. And I imagine if you're Leonard Cohen, you're asking yourself who the hell you are in this situation, which any good artist does all the time. Who am I to stand up and speak? Who am I to sing something? Who am I to write this book? What could I have to say that's possibly worth anyone's time? Which is a good question for an artist to ask at any point, but certainly when you're facing people who have their lives on the line, I'm sure it must have occurred to someone as sensitive as Leonard Cohen. And one answer he seems to have come up with is that maybe his songs can protect them. And that idea actually appears in a song, which is the song that he writes in the war, which is his song, Lover, 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 which is written at an Israeli Air Force base. And it's a story that I tell in the book. And in the song, which is a very strange song, if you understand it as a love song, it's called Lover, Lover, Lover. So you might expect it to be a love song, but it doesn't really read like a love song. In one verse, he says, may the spirit of this song, may it rise up pure and free. May it be a shield for you, a shield against the enemy, which doesn't make a lot of sense unless we understand that he's singing it for the first time for an audience of Israeli pilots at this airbase, and these pilots are being decimated by anti-aircraft missiles over the Golan Heights and over Sinai. And it's the worst week in the history of the Israeli Air Force, and losses are so bad in the Air Force that they're being hidden from the public. And it's at that moment that Leonard Cohen gives them a kind of amulet in the form of his song. And the question is, why did he think that his words could protect people? And there are several possible explanations, but I think the one that speaks to me the most, and this is conjecture, because I guess we should say that Leonard Cohen is an extremely slippery character, and he never comes out and tells us what he's thinking or why he's doing what he's doing. And it can be maddening as a journalist trying to pin him down. But of course, it's what makes him Leonard Cohen, and I do my best to pin him down nonetheless. Leonard Cohen is a Cohen, and it's not a footnote to his personality. A Cohen, of course, is a priest in the Jewish tradition. The Cohen is descended from the temple priests who were in charge of sacrifices and ritual at the Jerusalem temple, which is destroyed by Rome in the year 70 CE. And the role of the priests in Judaism today is not like the role of priests in Catholicism or anything close. What remains of the priestly ritual, with a few exceptions, is the priestly blessing. You're supposed to get up in front of the congregation and you're supposed to recite these words, just 15 words in Hebrew, which call down divine protection on the congregation. That's your job. Yevarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha. May God bless and protect you. And Leonard Cohen says explicitly a few times in his interviews over the years that being a Cohen was important to him. And in this manuscript that he writes about the war, I was shocked at how often it came up. I mean, I knew he was a Jew, I knew he was wrestling with Judaism, but I had no idea that it was so important or so present in his mind, not just that he was a Cohen, but that he was a bad Cohen, that he had a job to do and he wasn't doing it. He should have been at the synagogue in Montreal helping to protect the congregation, as his father had done and as his grandfather had done. And yet he was off doing something completely different, in Greenwich Village and the 60s and everything else that, Leonard Cohen became. And he had this idea that this was something that he could do and should do. And I think it's interesting to look at that line, may this song be a shield for you against the enemy, is not all that distant from may God bless and protect you. And here Leonard Cohen finds himself standing in front of the congregation, in front of his people, in front of people who he understood to be his family in some strange and not entirely comfortable way. And he tries to protect them because that's what he thinks he has to offer in this situation. So I think, understanding that song and understanding what he was doing in the war really requires us to understand the inner workings of Leonard Cohen's mind. Not that I claim to understand them, but the book is an attempt to get at the soul of a great artist through this one moment, just this one moment in 1973, and to use Leonard Cohen, or to use the war to understand Leonard Cohen in a new light, and at the same time to use Leonard Cohen to understand the war in a new light.
Yeah, and you do that beautifully. And I think, there's a line in there that as you were giving the answer about him being a Cohen also resounded kind of in my mind. The one that Joan Baez says about him, you'll remember it better than I do, but she's talking about how you don't need to, like, his songs don't necessarily make sense, and they don't really need to make sense because the listener has this feeling that they come from this infinite depth, or I don't know how she says it, inside of him, that doesn't need translation. And I think in the scenes you evoke of these soldiers, half asleep, half dead, exhausted, lost, like having this almost mystical vision of this poet, musician arriving and his voice floating over to them. Some of them who know who he is, not believing it could be him. Others have never heard of him, being so moved that they remember it till the end of their days. I think there's something in that too, beyond the status of whatever he may have been born into in Judaism, was what he was born into in some sense, poetically, spiritually. I guess I know I'm going to leave time. We have 5 more minutes for you and I to talk, and I'm definitely going to leave time because we have so many questions that are piling up, and I do want to get to those. But a couple of last questions, maybe, if we can. One really about that you kind of alluded to about not just how Israel changed after this war, which is something, I know we have a lot of Israelis present in the audience that people will know a great deal about, but also really how music in Israel changed after this war and sort of went in more of the direction of Cohen, so away from a kind of, I think as you put it, collective toward the individual soul and the spiritual life of the country, sort of moving in the same direction. And you write pretty beautifully about a singer, musician that I love, Mayor Ariel, who is kind of a, equal, if we can say equal, a similar figure in Israel, and sort of his story as a soldier in this war and what happens with his music. And I wonder if you can just say a little bit about how you see that shift, that we can't say that Cohen instigated it, but he seemed to have existed in parallel to something deep in the country that was shifting.
Absolutely. Those two figures, I find them fascinating. Mayor Ariel is not well known outside Israel, but in Israel, he is a kind of Cohen-esque figure. He's really, in my opinion, the only Israeli artist who's really Cohen's equal in terms of lyrics and originality of thought and expression. And Mayor Ariel and Leonard Cohen, I don't think they met each other, even though I would love to believe that they did. And in the book, I almost insinuate that they did, even though I know that they really didn't. But they were at the same place in Suez City at the end of the Yom Kippur War. They were within a mile or two of each other for sure when Cohen played a show in this kind of ruined fertilizer plant, this kind of apocalyptic scene on the Suez Canal. And Ariel's there as a paratrooper. And Ariel had already started playing music, but after the war, he becomes much more open to kind of Cohen-esque, not that it's because of Cohen's influence, but it becomes open to the same things that Cohen's open to. The soul, God. Mayor Ariel, like Leonard Cohen, eventually writes songs that are actually prayers. And he stops speaking in the collective we, which was to a large extent the language of Israeli music before the 73 war. It's very much the country of the kibbutz, and the music is all us and we, and the collective really goes out of fashion after the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, and it becomes about the individual and the individual soul, and it's less military entertainment troops, and it's more the singer-songwriter kind of exploring his or her own mind and soul. And Israeli music after the war is much more similar to Leonard Cohen than it was before. And that's one of the reasons I think that Israelis love Leonard Cohen so much, because he also tries to access, the depths of the Jewish soul or the human soul. And there's a lot of Israeli music that tries to do that too. And Mayor Ariel is probably the best example of an Israeli artist who reaches the same heights as Cohen, and also suffers in many ways the same fate as Cohen, which is that he never quite has the love of the mainstream that's enjoyed by other artists, because it's easier to be popular and there are much easier ways to sell a lot of records. And if you insist on your own creative message, even if it's not, going to sell millions of records, you will suffer for many, many years. But at the end, if you're lucky, you will be venerated as a true original. And that happens both to Mayor Ariel and it happens to Leonard Cohen as well.
Yeah. I guess in closing, before I get to audience questions, you raise the point of the complications of how Cohen looks back at this time, complications being that he almost never references it. I mean, there are songs that allude to it. But later on, this enormous vertical seizure that I think we see and sort of happening to him becomes a memory or an event that's filled with some ambivalence. And he even goes on to take away lyrics from Lover, Lover, Lover that he sung that were explicitly about his brothers and, Israeli soldiers. And I wonder how you see that and why you think, in a sense, whether you think this was, as Leon Wieseltier has it, a kind of more, an event that, what does he say? He says he spoke about his most private experiences, but never about his public ones. And whether somehow this was continuous with how Cohen thought about and talked about his life, or whether this way he thought about these events are particular.
It's a wonderful question, and I think that a few things are going on here. Leonard Cohen is his subject is the universal soul. He's trying to access the human soul. It's your subject, Nicole. And you do it so beautifully. And I guess I'll just going to throw in a plug here for To Be a Man, which is Nicole's recent collection of short stories, which is the best fiction I've read in years and years and years. And it gets exactly at that place. And also it has that same kind of powerful connection to Israel, which I think Leonard Cohen would have appreciated. And I certainly do, but that connection is not It's not a simple connection. So Leonard Cohen is not a journalist. He's not covering the Yom Kippur War. He can't be limited to one war or to one side of a war. And there's a lot about that in the book, about this missing verse, this verse of lover, lover, lover that he writes in the heat of the moment, in the heat of his identification with the Israeli soldiers, and then erases because he realizes that he's gone too far into his tribal allegiances. And he has a moment in the war where he breaks, a moment where he realizes, we can get into it maybe in the Q&A, I see we're running out of time, but where he realizes he's gone too far. And that tribal allegiance, I think, is something that he's very suspicious of. And he doesn't want to be, on one side necessarily, but of course he is, but he doesn't want to be, and he doesn't leave Israel waving the Israeli flag and singing the national anthem. He leaves, I think, upset and rattled by what he'd seen, as of course, you have to be if you're a sensitive person like Leonard Cohen, who's just seen something truly awful and horrific, like a war. So he's seen Israelis at their best, because in a war, people are at their best in many ways. And he's seen people at their worst. And he's seen some of the best that humanity can offer and some of the worst. And it all plays out in Israel. And he basically never speaks of this again, with the exception of a few comments, which I put in the book. He's quiet about it until the end of his life. And I think that indicates some discomfort about what he'd seen and what his role in it had been. And of course, that's very Jewish, that wrestling with the tribal and the universal, and who am I and where do I belong and what's my role in all of this? And am I this or am I that? And am I more this or more that? And you can really see it in Leonard Cohen's music, and you can really see it in the story of Who by Fire, which is one of the reasons that I love the story. I think it's it's a great Jewish story, not because it will necessarily make Jews feel great, but it's a great Jewish story because it's a meeting of the diaspora in Israel at a moment of crisis. It's a meeting of one of the great voices of the age with young Israelis at the worst moment of their lives. And there's just a lot of Jewish weight in that moment. And of course, it's an extreme circumstance that many of us can't even, would find it hard to imagine, but that wrestling with identity and place and community is something that, is necessarily part of Jewish life.
Yeah. So, question from the audience. Someone asked, can you speak about the connection between the three most important parts of the Yom Kippur Prayers and Leonard Cohen?
Sure, that will only take 6 or 7 hours. So I hope you'll all just bear with me. In the book, I mentioned 3 moments in the Yom Kippur service which evoke parts of this story, and one of them is the priestly blessing, which I've spoken about already, which I think plays into the story of the war tour in a big way and plays into Cohen's final concert in Israel in a very interesting way. And there are probably people here on the call who were at the 2009 concert and remember how it ended. It ends with quite an incredible moment in which Cohen recites the priestly blessing. The other moment that I mentioned in the book, or one of the 2 others, is the book of Jonah, which is just an incredible story. It's incredibly brief, and it's about a prophet who is the only prophet in the Bible who tries to run away. God speaks to Jonah, and he doesn't do what Abraham does, which is to say, here I am. Abraham, when he's faced with this terrible message from God, which is going to be that he has to sacrifice his son, he says one word, hineni, here I am. He doesn't go anywhere, but Jonah tries to get out, and he runs away to Jaffa, and he gets on a boat into the Mediterranean, and he tries to evade the divine message, which doesn't end up working out. But something about that evoked Cohen to me, because he's engaged, as he put it, throughout his life in attempts to escape. And he escapes Montreal for New York, and then he escapes New York for London, and then London for Hydra, and he escapes from woman to woman, and he escapes into substances, and he escapes in many different ways until at the very end, he doesn't try to escape. And the Hebrew word that appears in his final song, as many of you probably know, You Want It Darker, the Hebrew word is hineni, which is the word that is the opposite of escape. It's the opposite of the book of Jonah. And the third moment in the service, which is related to the title of the book and to many other parts of the book, is maybe the peak of the Yom Kippur service, which is called Unetane Tokef. It's this very weird prayer that's beautiful in some ways, very crude in other ways, which tells you that God is sitting on his throne and he's judging us on the Day of Atonement. And he's going to decide in the coming year who is going to live and who's going to die. And then it goes on to explain in which ways we could die, who by water and who by fire. And it goes on and on, who by wild beast and who by sword and who by earthquake and strangulation. And it gets very, very graphic. And, not long after that prayer was recited in synagogues on Yom Kippur in October 1973, a war broke out and thousands of Israelis were sent to die in the ways that are spelled out in the prayer. And it's another one of those details that you can't make up in a novel. It could only be true. And it's a big part of the story. So Cohen experiences the Yom Kippur War, right? It's not just a war, it's a war that's linked in our memories with the Day of Atonement. It's called the Yom Kippur War. Sometimes it's called the War of Atonement, as if the war itself was an atonement. And there's a lot of, spirituality and religion wrapped up in this, conflict in October 1973. Cohen experiences this with Israelis. And then not long after the war, we look at his notebook and we see this song called Who by Fire, which is Cohen's riff on precisely that prayer. So those are the three moments that I single out in the book, which is not just about the war, not just about Leonard Cohen. In some ways, it's about Yom Kippur, which is, a pretty pregnant date to have a war break out on.
So I think do we have time for one or two more questions, Matti? What do you think?
I'm here all night.
Two more questions. Somebody asks you, says your book seemed to be committed to the story behind the story. Is this purposeful? I mean, what is that what you mean to be doing? And I think it's kind of an interesting question because the construction of your books are really unusual. Maybe you want to try to answer that one.
Thank you. I'm going to have to sit and think for 10 minutes while you watch me, because I'm not a very, I don't know to what extent I'm aware of exactly what I'm doing. I think of myself as a reporter. I was trained at most of the time at the AP, which is really a news agency. And I still think of myself as someone who's reporting, which is more like being a carpenter than being a sculptor. And so I'm not sure I always know exactly, but yes, Nicole.
Can I say
help me out.
I want to say that I think, like in this case, your story takes this event of Leonard Cohen's life, and it takes this historical event of a war in Israel. But the book is actually filled with human experience. The opening chapter is about like kids on a base in Sinai, like, smoking and having a great time. And suddenly, you feel as if you're there as the Egyptians attack. And everywhere in the book, there are these little portraits of life that feel so deep and so closely observed that one can't believe that you weren't there. And so I think in that sense, you are always bringing a kind of individual human story to light out of these larger stories. I guess last question, this is a kind of interesting question I find. Someone asks, was there a similar transformational experience or encounter that changed your relationship with Israel or with your work?
If I had to choose one, it would be, I moved here when I was 17 from Canada with certain ideas about the country, and then very quickly found myself in a military outpost as a soldier in South Lebanon, and was exposed to the Middle East, which I hadn't really been thinking about when I moved to Israel, and kind of became aware of this incredible complexity, the incredible complexities of the country, which are only hinted at in the official stories of Israel. And I think since that time of incredible confusion, this very exciting time in my life when I was a soldier in the late 90s in South Lebanon at an outpost called Outpost Pumpkin, which I also wrote a book about eventually, I've been trying to unravel the country. I've been trying to figure out what this place is, this place where I've ended up living my life for the past 27 years. And I think that's part of what if I force myself into self-reflection, which is not my usual mode, I think that's part of what's going on in this book, because, I'm not Leonard Cohen, of course, and my little war wasn't the Yom Kippur War, but the idea of a Canadian who is dropped into a Middle Eastern catastrophe and tries to figure it out, there's a reason that story seems evocative to me. And I thought that perhaps something in there would help me figure out my own situation and the place where I live. And I think that's part of what's going on in the story. And if the story is, I always work in micro stories. I don't look for, broad stories. I'm really trying to zoom in as tightly as I can. And in a weird way, when you zoom in very, very tightly, you get the most universal themes. When you're just talking about one kid who's at a base in 1973 in Sinai, as you mentioned, or one confused singer at a, dark moment in his life, that's going to give you more universal themes than a book that tries to be universal, than a book that really tries to zoom out. So that's what I've tried to do, to zoom in so tight that you really get the human. And if you're not interested in the Yom Kippur War, you're not interested in Leonard Cohen, you still might be able to recognize yourself in this story.
Yes. Thank you, Matti. I love talking to you as always. I can't wait to read another book and we can go through this again together.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening.
Great, thank you, Nicole and Matti. I think this represents really the soul of the library in many ways. The library is about our place in the arc of civilization, and you are bringing it to light and contributing to the literature and to the civilization of our world, and in probing the human condition and really getting us thinking about our place in the world and our own identities. So we thank you so much for this very, very enriching conversation. I want to thank Deborah for her partnership with the library and work with us. And again, all of you for being a part of our community here at the library. Thank you all very, very much. Have a great day.